Hello, in this video I am going to tell you some scary stories about the amusement park. Hello, in this video I am going to tell the horror story of an original revenge. On a certain day, I received a letter from a private soldier, named Grapmar, attached to the garrison of San Francisco. I had known him but slightly, the acquaintance having come about through his interest in some stories which I had published, and which he had a way of calling psychological studies. He was a dreamy, romantic, fine-grained lad, proud as a tiger lily and sensitive as a bluebell. What mad caprice led him to join the army I never knew, but I did know that there he was wretchedly out of place, and I foresaw that his rude and repellent environment would make of him in time a deserter, or a suicide, or a murderer. The letter at first seemed a wild outpouring of despair, for it informed me that before it should reach me its author would be dead by his own hand. But when I had read farther I understood its spirit, and realized how coolly formed a scheme it disclosed and how terrible its purport was intended to be. The worst of the contents was the information that a certain officer, whom he named, had driven him to the deed, and that he was committing suicide for the sole purpose of gaining thereby the power to revenge himself upon his enemy. I learned afterward that the officer had received a similar letter. W.C. Morrow achieved a modicum of fame and fortune writing weird tales such as this in San Francisco journals and newspapers in the early 1900s. Then is just sort of drifted out of the scene. This story is from Morrow's collection, The Ape, the Idiot and Other People, available at Project Gutenberg. This was so puzzling that I sat down to reflect upon the young man's peculiarities. He had always seemed somewhat uncanny, and had I proved more sympathetic he doubtless would have gone farther and told me of certain problems which he professed to have solved concerning the life beyond this. One thing that he had said came back vividly: if I could only overcome that purely gross and animal love of life that makes us all shun death, I would kill myself, for I know how far more powerful I could be in spirit than in flesh. The manner of the suicide was startling, and that was what might have been expected from this odd character. Evidently scorning the flummery of funerals, he had gone into a little canyon near the military reservation and blown himself into a million fragments with dynamite, so that all of him that was ever found was some minute particles of flesh and bone. I kept the letter a secret, for I desired to observe the officer without rousing his suspicion of my purpose. It would be an admirable test of a dead man's power and deliberate intention to haunt the living, for so I interpreted the letter. The officer thus to be punished was an oldish man, short, apoplectic, overbearing, and irascible. Generally he was kind to most of the men in a way, but he was gross and mean, and that explained sufficiently his harsh treatment of young Grapmar, whom he could not understand, and his efforts to break that flighty young man's spirit. Not very long after the suicide certain modifications in the officer's conduct became apparent to my watchful oversight. His choler, though none the less sporadic, developed a quality which had some of the characteristics of senility, and yet he was still in his prime, and passed for a sound man. He was a bachelor, and had lived always alone, but presently he began to shirk solitude at night and court it in daylight. His brother officers chaffed him, and thereupon he would laugh in rather a forced and silly fashion, quite different from the ordinary way with him, and would sometimes, on these occasions, blush so violently that his face would become almost purple. His soldierly alertness and sternness relaxed surprisingly at some times, and at others were exaggerated into unnecessary acerbity, his conduct in this regard suggesting that of a drunken man who knows that he is drunk and who now and then makes a brave effort to appear sober. All these things, and more, indicating some mental strain, or some dreadful apprehension, or perhaps something worse than either, were observed partly by me and partly by an intelligent officer whose watch upon the man had been secured by me. To be more particular, the afflicted man was observed often to start suddenly and in alarm, look quickly round, and make some unintelligent monosyllabic answer, seemingly to an inaudible question that no visible person had asked. He acquired the reputation, too, of having taken lately to nightmares, for in the middle of the night he would shriek in the most dreadful fashion, alarming his roommates prodigiously. After these attacks he would sit up in bed, his ruddy face devoid of color, his eyes glassy and shining, his breathing broken with gasps, and his body wet with a cold perspiration. Knowledge of these developments and transformations spread throughout the garrison, but the few, mostly women, who dared to express sympathy or suggest a tonic encountered so violent rebuffs that they blessed heaven for escaping alive from his word volleys. Even the garrison surgeon, who had a kindly manner, and the commanding general, who was constructed on dignified and impressive lines, received little thanks for their solicitude. Clearly the doughty old officer, who had fought like a bulldog in 2 wars and 100 battles, was suffering deeply from some undiscoverable malady. The next extraordinary thing which he did was to visit one evening, not so clandestinely as to escape my watch, a spirit medium, extraordinary, because he always had scoffed at the idea of spirit communications. I saw him as he was leaving the medium's rooms. His face was purple, his eyes were bulging and terrified, and he tottered in his walk. A policeman, seeing his distress, advanced to assist him, whereupon the soldier hoarsely begged, "Call a hack." Into it he fell, and asked to be driven to his quarters. I hastily ascended to the medium's rooms, and found her lying unconscious on the floor. Soon, with my aid, she recalled her wits, but her conscious state was even more alarming than the other. At first she regarded me with terror, and cried, "It is horrible for you to hound him so." I assured her that I was hounding no one. "Oh, I thought you were the spur, but it was standing exactly where you are," she exclaimed. "I suppose so," I agreed, "but you can see that I am not the young man's spirit. However, I am familiar with this whole case, madam, and if I can be of any service in the matter, I should be glad if you would inform me. I am aware that our friend is persecuted by a spirit which visits him frequently, and I am positive that through you it has informed him that the end is not far away, and that our elderly friend's death will assume some terrible form. Is there anything that I can do to avert the tragedy?" The woman stared at me in a horrified silence. "How did you know these things?" she gasped. "That is immaterial. When will the tragedy occur? Can I prevent it?" Yes, she exclaimed. "It will happen this very night. But no earthly power can prevent it." She came close to me and looked at me with an expression of the most acute terror. "Merciful God! What will become of me? He is to be murdered, you understand, murdered in cold blood by a spirit, and he knows it and I know it. If he is spared long enough he will tell them at the garrison, and they will all think that I had something to do with it. Oh, this is terrible, terrible, and yet I dare not say a word in advance. Nobody there would believe in what the spirits say, and they will think that I had a hand in the murder." The woman's agony was pitiful. "Be assured that he will say nothing about it," I said, "and if you keep your tongue from wagging you need fear nothing." With this and a few other hurried words of comfort, I soothed her and hastened away. For I had interesting work on hand. It is not often that one may be in at such a murder as that. I ran to a livery stable, secured a swift horse, mounted him, and spurred furiously for the reservation. The hack, with its generous start, had gone far on its way, but my horse was nimble, and his legs felt the pricking of my eagerness. A few miles of this furious pursuit brought me within sight of the hack just as it was crossing a dark ravine near the reservation. As I came nearer I imagined that the hack swayed somewhat, and that a fleeing shadow escaped from it into the tree-banked further wall of the ravine. I certainly was not in error with regard to the swaying, for it had roused the dull notice of the driver. I saw him turn, with an air of alarm in his action, and then pull up with a heavy swing upon the reins. At this moment I dashed up and halted. "Anything the matter?" I asked. "I don't know," he answered, getting down. I felt the carriage sway, and I see that the door's wide open. Guess my load thought he'd sobered up enough to get out and walk, without troubling me or his pocketbook. Meanwhile I too had alighted, then struck a match, and by its light we discovered, through the open door, the load huddled confusedly on the floor of the hack, face upward, his chin compressed upon his breast by his leaning against the further door, and looking altogether vulgar, misshapen, and miserably unlike a soldier. He neither moved nor spoke when we called. We hastily clambered within and lifted him upon the seat, but his head rolled about with an awful looseness and freedom, and another match disclosed a ghastly dead face and wide eyes that stared horribly at nothing. "You would better drive the body to headquarters," I said. Instead of following, I cantered back to town, housed my horse, and went straightway to bed, and this will prove to be the first information that I was the mysterious man on a horse, whom the coroner could never find. About a year afterwards I received the following letter, which is observed to be in fair English, from Stockholm, Sweden. "Dear Sir, For some years I have been reading your remarkable psychological studies with great interest, and I take the liberty to suggest a theme for your able pen. I have just found in a library here a newspaper, dated about a year ago, in which is an account of the mysterious death of a military officer in a hack. Then followed the particulars, as I have already detailed them, and the very theme of post-mortem revenge, which I have adopted in this setting out of facts. Some persons may regard the coincidence between my correspondent's suggestion and my private and exclusive knowledge as being a very remarkable thing, but there are likely even more wonderful things in the world, and at none of them do I longer marvel. More extraordinary still is his suggestion that in the dynamite explosion a dog or a quarter of beef might as well have been employed as a suicide-minded man, that, in short, the man may not have killed himself at all, but might have employed a presumption of such an occurrence to render more effective a physical persecution ending in murder by the living man who had posed as a spirit. The letter even suggested an arrangement with a spirit medium, and I regard that also as a queer thing. The declared purpose of this letter was to suggest material for another of my psychological studies, but I submit that the whole affair is of too grave a character for treatment in the levity of fiction. And if the facts and coincidences should prove less puzzling to others than to me, a praiseworthy service might be done to humanity by the presentation of whatever solution a better understanding than mine might evolve. The only remaining disclosure which I am prepared now to make is that my correspondent signed himself Ramtag, an odd-sounding name, but for all I know it may be respectable in Sweden. And yet there is something about the name that haunts me unceasingly, much as does some strange dream which we know we have dreamt and yet which it is impossible to remember. Thank you for watching this video, and to support me, like the video, and if you like this type of video, subscribe to the channel. Bye until the next videos.